H1. Alien princess saw me as I put on my armor, and when she noticed my scar, she was astonished. The galaxy was old. That was the first thing every human diplomat, soldier, and scientist was told before they stepped onto a Concorde vessel or walked into a Concorde hall. The galaxy was old, and humanity was not. The other species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before the first human being ever looked up at the sky and wondered what was out there. They had built empires, signed treaties, started wars, ended them, and written entire philosophies about the meaning of existence, all before humanity had figured out how to split the atom. So, when Earth finally made contact with the Galactic Concorde in the year 2177, the welcome was not exactly warm. It was not hostile either. The Concorde was too old and too careful for outright hostility over something as minor as a new species showing up with shiny new ships and wide, excited eyes. What it was, more than anything, was indifferent. Humanity was allowed a seat at the table. They were given a small voice on minor matters. They were watched the way a patient teacher watches a child who has just picked up a tool for the first time, with the quiet, tired expectation that something was going to be dropped or broken soon. 10 years passed. The seat stayed small. The voice stayed quiet. And then came the assignment. Corporal Ethan Cole was sitting in the break room of Forward Operating Base Helix on the outer edge of the Proxima Belt, when his commanding officer walked in and told him that he had been chosen to lead a personal honor guard for Princess Valeth of the Zyran Empire. Ethan was eating a bowl of instant oatmeal at the time. He looked up from the bowl, looked at his commanding officer, and said nothing for about 4 seconds. "Me," he said. "You," said Colonel Ned Harris, dropping a folder on the table like it was the man's problem now. Ethan Cole was 31 years old. He had spent the last 8 years in uniform, and most of those years in places that did not appear on public maps. He was not tall, but he was solid. The kind of build that came not from a gym, but from years of carrying heavy things over difficult ground. His hair was dark and cut short. His face was calm in the way that faces become calm after they have been through enough that nothing surprising feels surprising anymore. There was a scar that started just below his left collarbone and ran diagonally across his ribs to the right side of his hip. There were others too, smaller and older, scattered across his arms and neck and hands. He had stopped noticing them the same way a road stops noticing its own potholes. He had a reputation, not the kind that comes from speeches or medals, though he had a few of those. The kind that comes from the people who served next to him, who said things like, "He doesn't panic, and he doesn't quit." And if you're in a bad spot, and Ethan Cole is in the same bad spot, your odds just got better, without either of you doing anything different. Colonel Harris pulled out a chair and sat down. He explained the situation in plain terms. The Zyran Empire was the oldest and most powerful civilization currently holding membership in the Galactic Concorde. They were not simply influential. They were the reason the Concorde functioned at all. 3 of the Concorde's 7 founding agreements had been written by Zyran scholars. Their military, the Velketh, was considered the finest fighting force in the known galaxy, and they had been considered that for roughly 2,000 years without serious argument. Princess Valeth was the Emperor's only daughter. She was traveling to Concorde Central on a diplomatic mission of considerable importance, the details of which were above Ethan's clearance level, and also, Harris made clear, none of his business. What was his business was keeping her safe during the transit period and the 3 days of formal proceedings that followed. Earth had been asked to supply a small honor guard as a gesture of cooperation and goodwill. "Why us?" Ethan asked. "Because the Zyran asked specifically for a human unit," Harris said. Ethan thought about that. Why would they do that? Harris shrugged. Politics. Probably they want to be seen acknowledging Earth's membership in some small, controllable way, without actually giving us anything meaningful. You know how it goes. Ethan did know how it went. He had watched it go that way for the entirety of his adult life. Harris told him he could choose 3 people from his current unit. Ethan did not take long. Danny Reeves was the first name he wrote down. Danny was 26, from a small town in Ohio, and had the particular gift of being able to fix almost any piece of technology, while explaining in great detail exactly why it had broken in the first place, usually in the same sentence. He was loud in a way that most soldiers found annoying and commanders found useful because it meant the team was never completely silent, and silence, in Ethan's experience, was where anxiety lived. Danny had also saved Ethan's life once with a stripped power cable and 7 seconds of creative thinking, which counted for quite a lot. Aaron Price was the second name. Aaron was 29, from New Mexico, and was the kind of man who could go an entire mission day saying fewer than 20 words and still be the most present person in the room. He was a sniper by training and an observer by nature. He noticed things. Ethan had learned over 3 years of working with him to pay attention when Aaron's eyes went still and focused, because it usually meant something important was about to happen. Lily Grant was the third. Lily was 32, from a small city in Georgia, and had been a combat medic for 9 years. She had the calm, no-nonsense energy of someone who had seen enough bad situations to know that falling apart in one was a waste of everyone's time, including her own. She was the kind of medic who told you the truth about your injury before she started treating it, on the grounds that knowing what was wrong was always better than being surprised by it later. The 4 of them were briefed together the following morning by a Concord liaison officer, a pale, thin man named Admiral Gao, who had been working in xeno-diplomatic relations for 20 years and had the look of someone who had spent most of those years being quietly exhausted. The briefing covered siren customs in careful detail. Do not make prolonged direct eye contact. It is considered a challenge. Do not speak in the presence of the princess unless she addresses you first. Do not display any sign of physical pain, discomfort, or injury while on duty. Do not reveal the existence of any past wounds or medical history. That last one was the one Gao spent the most time on. Among the Zyren, he explained, the body was considered a direct reflection of a warrior's fitness and capability. A soldier who had suffered a serious wound was, in their culture, ceremonially and practically retired from active duty. Not as a punishment, simply as a matter of logic. The body had been tested and found to have a limit. The limit had been reached. To continue in service past that point was considered not brave, but reckless, and worse, irresponsible to the people depending on you. Gao looked specifically at Ethan when he said this. His eyes moved, briefly and professionally, to the scar visible at the collar of Ethan's shirt, and then away again. Ethan said nothing. That evening, the 4 of them boarded a shuttle and headed toward the Velkara, the Zyren diplomatic vessel that was already holding position just beyond Earth's orbital lane. Silent and enormous and old, lit from within by a soft silver light that made it look less like a ship and more like something that had simply decided to exist in that particular spot and had been there ever since. Danny pressed his face against the shuttle window and said, "Okay, that is a very big ship." Aaron said nothing. Lily checked her medkit for the 3rd time. Ethan watched the Velkara grow larger in the viewport and thought about what it meant to be watched by something that had been here so much longer than you. Alien Princess saw me as I put on my armor, and when she noticed my scar, she was astonished. The Velkara was not a ship that made you feel welcome. It was not designed to make you feel anything in particular, and that was somehow worse. Everything aboard it was functional, precise, and completely indifferent to the comfort of the people moving through it. The ceilings were high, built for a species that stood nearly 7 feet tall, which meant that Ethan and his team walked through every corridor with the low, quiet awareness of being slightly too small for the space they were occupying. The walls were a pale silver gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air was clean in a way that felt almost aggressive about it, as if the ship's systems had decided that nothing as impure as a smell was going to be permitted to exist on board. The Zyran themselves moved through these spaces with a quiet, unhurried confidence that came from thousands of years of knowing exactly who they were and where they stood in relation to everyone else. They were tall and lean, with silver skin that had a faint luminescent quality to it, like moonlight caught in still water. Their eyes were large and shifted color depending on their mood. Silver when they were calm, gold when they were curious, deep red when they were displeased. They had 4 fingers on each hand and moved with a precision that made even their casual gestures look deliberate. They looked at Ethan's team the way someone looks at a piece of furniture that has been placed in an unusual spot. Not with hostility, but with a mild, persistent sense that something was slightly out of order. The Velketh were the worst about it. The Velketh were the princess's personal guard, and they were everything that their reputation promised. Each one of them stood over 6.5 feet tall. They wore dark armor that seemed to shift and settle when they moved, like it was alive and paying attention. They said very little, and when they looked at Ethan and his team, there was something in their eyes that was not quite contempt, but was close enough to it that the difference did not matter much in practice. Their commander was a Velketh officer named Sorath Vel, broad-shouldered even by Zyran standards, with eyes that stayed a cool, flat silver almost all the time, which Ethan had already learned meant he was either perpetually calm or perpetually unimpressed. Probably both. Sorath Vel had looked at the 4 humans when they first came aboard, said nothing, and then gone back to looking at the corridor ahead of him with the focused disinterest of a man who had decided not to waste energy on something he did not consider a serious variable. Ethan did not take it personally. He had been underestimated before. He understood by now that being underestimated was not always a problem. The first 2 days passed in a careful quiet. The humans were given a set of rooms near the rear of the diplomatic section. Functional, clean, tall-ceilinged like everything else. They kept their own schedule, rotated watch shifts, stayed professional, and gave the Zyran no reason to look at them twice. Danny spent most of his off hours studying the ship's visible architecture and making notes on a small handheld that he carried everywhere. Aaron watched the Velketh move through their patrol routes and said nothing, but Ethan noticed him adjusting his own position during watches to cover the angles that the Velketh left open, which was a habit Aaron had that Ethan found quietly reassuring. Lily kept her medkit organized and reorganized, and spent one long evening writing a letter home that she did not send, because the ship's communication protocols were restricted during transit. On the morning of the 3rd day, the first formal diplomatic session was scheduled to begin. Ethan woke before the others. He was always the first awake. Had been for years. He got up in the gray pre-session quiet and began to go through the process of putting on his armor. It was not the ceremonial kind. Earth had offered to outfit the honor guard in something more formal and decorative, with polished plates and the Concord's insignia stamped on the shoulders. Ethan had looked at the offered set, noted that it restricted shoulder rotation by about 15 degrees, and added unnecessary weight at the lower back, and had politely declined. He wore his standard-issue combat armor instead. It was not pretty, but it fit him like a second skin, and he had worn it in enough bad situations to trust it the way you trust something that has already been honest with you about what it can and cannot do. The preparation chamber was a plain room off the main sleeping area. There was a bench, a flat surface for laying out gear, and a mirror on the far wall that was taller than Ethan needed. He laid the pieces out in the order he always did. Chest plate first, then back. Shoulder guards, gauntlets, greaves, helmet last, and usually not until he was walking out the door. He pulled off his undershirt. He did not think about the scar. He had not thought about it in any conscious way for a long time. It was simply there. The way his left knee was slightly stiff in cold conditions, and the way his right hand had a small tremor after extended use. Things the body kept as records of its own history, filed away and no longer urgent. The scar ran from just below his left collarbone, wide and pale, and raised slightly at the center, crossing diagonally over his ribs and ending at the right side of his hip. It was the kind of scar that told a story whether you wanted it to or not. There were others. A burn mark across his left shoulder, old and smooth. A cluster of small shrapnel scars along his right forearm. A pale, thin ridge along the side of his neck from a close-range ricochet that had made his left ear ring for 2 weeks straight. He reached for the first chest piece and began to put it on. He did not know that the door at the far end of the preparation chamber connected through a short service corridor to the observation walkway that ran along the outer wall of the diplomatic section. He did not know that Princess Veilith had arrived 20 minutes early to the morning proceedings and had taken the long route through the observation walkway because she preferred the view of open space to the interior corridors. And he certainly did not know that the transparisteel partition between the walkway and the preparation chamber was one-way reflective from the walkway side, meaning that from where Veilith was standing, she could see everything in that room clearly, while from inside the room, the partition looked like a plain gray wall. Veilith had not meant to stop. She had been walking at her usual pace, her attendants trailing 2 steps behind her, her mind already moving through the points she intended to raise in the morning session. She had glanced through the partition the way you glance at things in passing, without real intention. And then she had stopped. She stood completely still. Her attendants stopped behind her, exchanging a quick, uncertain look. Princess Veilith was 27 years old by Zyran reckoning, which placed her somewhere around 140 in human years, though she carried it the way the Zyran always did, looking neither old nor particularly young, just present and composed and entirely certain of herself. She had studied humanity in an academic sense. She had read the reports. She had been told that humans were a new species, physically unremarkable, short-lived, prone to error, and carried along mostly by a kind of reckless energy that more established civilizations had learned to view as a liability. She had believed all of it. What she was looking at now did not match any of it. The human soldier in the preparation chamber was not large. He was not imposing in the way the Velketh were imposing, but he moved through the process of suiting up with a stillness and an economy of motion that she recognized. It was the movement of someone who had done a thing so many times that it no longer required thought. It was the movement of someone completely at home in their own body, and his body was a record of damage that made the air leave her lungs. Among the Zyran, a warrior who carried a wound of that scale was taken off the line. It was not a question. It was not a debate. The Vel Sora, the deep damage, was recognized, and the warrior was honored and retired. The Zyran did not ask their injured to return to the post. They did not believe in it. They believed the body's limits were real, and that ignoring them was not strength, but foolishness. The human below her was fastening his chest plate over a scar that should have ended him. He did it without drama, without any visible awareness that what he was covering up was extraordinary. He simply picked up the next piece of armor, and the next, and kept going. Veilith's eyes shifted slowly from their usual calm silver to a deep, quiet violet. Behind her, the youngest of her attendants whispered something. She did not hear it. She was watching Ethan Cole finish putting on his armor, and she was revising, piece by piece, everything she thought she already knew. Alien princess saw me as I put on my armor. and when she noticed my scar, she was astonished. Valeth had broken protocol exactly once before in her life. She had been 9 years old, and she had walked into her father's war council, uninvited, because she had heard the generals arguing through the door, and had wanted to know what they were arguing about. Her father had looked at her across the long table, surrounded by his senior commanders, and had said nothing for a very long moment. Then he had told her to sit down. She had sat, she had listened to the entire meeting. Afterward, her father had told her that walking into rooms you have not been invited into was either a very foolish habit or a very important one, depending entirely on whether you had a good reason for doing it. She had thought about that for a long time. She thought about it now, standing at the observation partition, watching the human soldier fasten the last buckle on his chest plate with the calm focus of a man who was entirely unaware he was being watched. She turned to her lead attendant, a careful older woman named Vel-Ara, and said, "Which door connects to that preparation room?" Vel-Ara's eyes went gold with concern, which was the Zyran equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "Your Highness, a morning session begins in," Valeth said again, very quietly. Vel-Ara told her. Valeth walked to it, pressed the release panel, and stepped inside. The effect was immediate and total. Danny Reeves, who had been sitting on the bench near the far wall, eating something out of a foil packet, made a sound that was not quite a word, and stood up so fast he knocked the foil packet off his knee. Aaron Price, who had been standing near the door with his arms folded, went completely still in the specific way he went still when something unexpected entered his field of awareness. Lily Grant looked up from the medkit she had been reorganizing, took one look at the group now standing in the doorway, the princess, her 2 attendants, and 3 Velketh guards who had followed Valeth in with the barely controlled urgency of people who had not been consulted about this decision, and set the medkit down slowly on the bench beside her. Ethan turned around. He was holding his left gauntlet. He had been about to put it on. He looked at Princess Valeth, standing in the doorway of his preparation room, and his face did what his face always did, which was very little. He did not reach for anything. He did not step back. He stood where he was and gave her the same steady, quiet attention he gave to most things. Valeth stepped further into the room. Her attendants stayed near the door. The Velketh guards filed in behind her and positioned themselves along the wall, which made the room feel considerably smaller than it had 30 seconds ago. Sorath Vel, the Velketh commander, came in last. He looked at Ethan with those flat silver eyes, and then he looked at Valeth. And Ethan could see him making the same calculation that every good soldier makes when their principal does something unexpected. Measuring the risk, filing it away, adjusting. Valeth looked directly at Ethan. Among the Zyran, prolonged direct eye contact was a challenge. Ethan had been briefed on this. He held her gaze anyway, not out of aggression, but because looking away from someone who was looking at you always struck him as slightly dishonest, and he had never been good at that particular kind of politeness. Valeth did not seem bothered by it. If anything, her eyes shifted slightly, silver edging toward gold. "You bear deep damage," she said. Her galactic standard was precise and clear, with a faint musical undertone that was characteristic of Zyran's speech. "How is it that you stand?" The room was very quiet. Danny looked at Ethan. Aaron looked at the wall. Lily looked at her hands for a moment, then back up. Ethan looked down at his own torso, where the chest plate now covered most of the scar, though the top edge of it was still visible above the armor's upper rim, pale and wide at the collarbone. He looked at it the way you look at something you have lived with long enough that you genuinely have to remind yourself that other people notice it. "It healed," he said. Valeth studied him. "Wounds of that scale do not simply heal." "They do," Ethan said. "It takes a while, but they do." Sorath Vel stepped forward then, not aggressively, but with the measured authority of a man who had been doing his job for a very long time, and had certain responsibilities that did not pause for interesting conversations. He addressed Ethan in Galactic Standard, with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone who might not know it yet. He said that among the Zyran, a wound of the kind the corporal carried was called Velsora, a wound that reached the deep structures, a wound that changed what the body was capable of. Zyran warriors who received Velsora were honored for their service and removed from active duty, not as a punishment, as a recognition. The body had shown its limit. The Concord recognized that limit and respected it. He said all of this in a voice that was professional and even, and carried underneath it, very faintly, the implication that the corporal might want to consider what this said about the wisdom of his continued service. Ethan listened to all of it. When Sorath Vel finished, there was a short pause. Then Ethan picked up his gauntlet and began putting it on. "With respect," he said, "we don't do that." Sorath Vel's eyes stayed silver. Valith's shifted again, something between gold and a color that her attendants, watching her carefully, had not seen from her in any situation they could recall. Vel-Ara later described it, in a private letter she wrote that evening, as the color of someone encountering a thing they do not have a word for yet. "Explain," Valith said. Ethan finished fastening the gauntlet. He looked at her. "The scar isn't the limit," he said. "It's just the record." Valith tilted her head very slightly. It was a small movement, but it changed her whole expression, made her look less like a princess conducting a diplomatic curiosity, and more like a person genuinely thinking about something for the first time. "A record," she said. "Of what happened," Ethan said, "not of what happens next." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where did it come from?" Ethan glanced at Danny, who gave him a look that said, "This is way above my pay grade, and also, please don't make things worse." He glanced at Aaron, who gave him nothing, which was Aaron's version of, "You're on your own." Lily just looked at him steadily, which was her way of saying, "I trust your judgment. Use it." Ethan looked back at Valith. "Proxima Station," he said. 4 years ago. Something changed in the room when he said that. It was the kind of change that happens in the air before weather arrives. A shift in pressure. A sense that what came next was going to matter. Valith looked at him carefully. "I have read the Concord's record of the Proxima Station engagement," she said. "It was classified as a minor territorial dispute, resolved without Concord intervention." "That's one way to describe it," Ethan said. His voice was even. It was not bitter, he had moved past bitter a long time ago. But there was something in it, a particular quality that came from knowing the full shape of something, and hearing it described in a way that left most of it out. Valith's eyes moved to his face, then back to the scar visible above his chestplate, then back to his face again, and she said, it not as a princess giving an instruction, but as someone who had just realized they were standing at the edge of a much larger story than the one they had walked in expecting to find. Ethan set down the helmet he had picked up. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back on the bench, sat down, and began to talk. "Alien princess saw me as I put on my armor, and when she noticed my scar, she was astonished." Ethan did not tell the story the way people tell stories they are proud of. He told it the way soldiers tell the real ones, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, looking mostly at the floor, speaking in plain sentences without decoration or drama, like he was reading from a report filed somewhere inside himself a long time ago, one he had not opened in a while but still knew by heart. Valith sat on the tall bench across from him. Her attendants stood near the door. The Velketh guards were still positioned along the wall, and Sorath Vel stood at the edge of the room with his arms at his sides, his silver eyes no longer flat and bored, but quiet and attentive in a way that was different from before. Danny had sat back down. Aaron had not moved from his spot near the door. Lily had her hands folded in her lap and was watching Ethan with the expression she wore when something mattered. The morning session was now going to be late. Nobody in the room mentioned it. Ethan started at the beginning. Proxima Station was a joint research outpost sitting at the edge of the Proxima Belt, about 11 light minutes from the nearest Concord relay point. It had been built as a cooperation project between Earth and two smaller Concord member species, the Verath and the Suleni, to study a cluster of unusual stellar formations in the region. It was not a military installation. It had a population of 43 people at the time of the attack. Researchers, support staff, 3 Concord technical advisors, and a 9-person security detail of which Ethan was a part, assigned there for a routine 4-month rotation. The Drakai Syndicate arrived on the 4th day of the 3rd month. The Drakai were not a Concord member species. They were mercenaries, hired soldiers who worked for whoever was paying, and asked very few questions about why. They had been contracted, Ethan explained, by a private corporate interest that had originally funded part of the station's construction, and believed it still had a legal claim to the station's research data. The corporate interest no longer officially existed. It had been dissolved 6 months earlier, following a Concord trade ruling that went against it. But the contract with the Drakai had apparently been arranged far enough in advance that it went ahead anyway, because the Drakai did not do refunds and did not particularly care about trade rulings that had nothing to do with them. They came in with 4 gunships and a boarding complement of 60 soldiers, against 9. Ethan said this without emphasis, just the numbers, plain and level, the way you state a fact about weather. Veylet's eyes had gone to a deep, still gold. She did not interrupt. The station's emergency distress signal went out within the first 4 minutes of contact. The nearest Concord response vessel was the Sorath Kell, a patrol cruiser sitting at Relay Point 7, which was approximately 4 hours away at standard burn. The Concord's duty officer at the relay point logged the distress signal, assessed the situation, and made the determination that Proxima Station did not qualify for emergency military response under Article 9 of the Concord's Intervention Charter, because it was a research installation rather than a strategic asset, and because the attacking force, while hostile, was not a member state military, which meant the incident was technically classified as a criminal matter rather than an act of war. A criminal matter. Ethan said those 2 words, and then stopped for a moment. Not because the memory still made him angry. It did not, or at least not in the sharp, immediate way it once had. But because he always paused there when he told the story, at that specific detail, because it was the detail that changed what everything after it meant. The Concorde did not come, not for 6 days. He and 8 other soldiers held that station for 11 days. The first 2 days were the worst in terms of numbers. The Drakai pushed hard early, trying to break through before a defense could be organized. They were professional soldiers, well equipped, and they had the overwhelming advantage in manpower. What they did not have was an accurate picture of what they were dealing with. They had been told the station's security detail was small, lightly armed, and standard. They had not been told much about the specific people in it, because whoever had briefed them had not thought that detail worth noting. Ethan did not use the word brave. He did not say anything about courage or will or the human spirit. He just described, in the same flat, careful voice, what each person did and when they did it. He talked about Aaron, a different Aaron, he said, his first spotter, a man named Cal Durham from West Texas, who had covered the eastern approach for 36 hours straight, from a position in the maintenance shaft above Corridor 4, eating nothing and sleeping in 15-minute intervals on a schedule he set himself, and who had made shots that should not have been physically possible given the angle and the distance, and who had done it again and again until the Drakai stopped using the eastern approach entirely. He talked about the medic, not Lily Grant who sat beside him now, but Karen Yost from Illinois, who had converted the station's small medical bay into a functioning triage center in under an hour, and had kept 4 critically wounded people alive for 6 days, with supplies designed for a research outpost's minor injuries and a level of creative problem-solving that, Ethan said, quietly, he still did not fully understand. On the 4th day, the shaped charge hit. It was a breach device, packed into the junction between Corridor 3 and the main research wing, detonated remotely. The explosion killed 2 members of Ethan's team instantly. It blew out a section of the corridor wall, and it sent a piece of hull plating, a torn, jagged section, roughly the length of a man's forearm, across the corridor at a speed that Ethan did not remember because he had not seen it coming. He woke up on the floor. Karen Yost was already beside him. She packed the wound with everything she had left in the field kit. She told him clearly and without softening it that the damage was serious, that moving was going to make it worse, and that he needed to stay down. He looked at the corridor. There were 2 of them left, who could still hold it. Him and one other, a young private named Pete Holloway, 22 years old, 6 months into his first deployment, who was standing at the far end of the corridor with a rifle and an expression on his face that Ethan recognized because he had worn it himself once, a long time ago, when he had been new enough to still be afraid of dying. Ethan stood up. He described this simply. He stood up, he picked up his weapon, he told Pete Holloway to take the left side, and he took the right, and they held the corridor. They held it through the rest of Day 4, and all of Day 5, and all of Day 6. Until 2 more members of the team who had been pinned down in the research wing managed to link back up with them, and then there were 4 of them, and then there were 5, and on Day 11, the Concorde relief vessels finally arrived, and the Drakai withdrew, and it was over. Ethan stopped talking. The room was completely silent. He was still looking at the floor, not with grief or with the need for anyone to respond. Just the particular quiet of a man who has finished saying a true thing, and is giving the air a moment to settle around it. Valeth had not moved for a very long time. Her eyes were a color that no one in the room had a name for. Not gold, not violet, not the silver of her usual calm. Something new and unclassified, the color of a mind encountering something it was not fully prepared for, and choosing to stay with it anyway, rather than look away. Sorath Vel was looking at the floor too. His jaw was tight. His hands, Ethan noticed, were not quite still. It was Valeth who finally spoke. The Concorde classified it as a criminal matter, she said. Her voice was very controlled, and did not respond. For 6 days, Ethan said. Yes, and you stayed. Ethan looked up at her then. It was our post, he said. The same words he had used before. But this time, they landed differently. Because now everyone in the room understood what they actually meant. Not a simple statement of duty, but a declaration about the kind of people who said it. The kind who stayed when they had every logical and physical reason to do otherwise. The kind who stood up from the floor when a better calculated species would have stayed down. Valeth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, almost to herself, "We have been measuring you with the wrong tools." Ethan did not answer that. There was nothing to add to it. He reached over, picked up his helmet from the bench beside him, and stood up. "We're going to be late to your session," he said. And he walked to the door and held it open, and waited. Alien Princess saw me as I put on my armor, and when she noticed my scar, she was astonished. The morning session started 40 minutes late. Nobody officially acknowledged why. The Concorde liaison officer, a thin, nervous man who had been waiting outside the main hall with a data tablet and an increasingly strained expression, said nothing when the doors finally opened and the Zyran delegation filed in. He looked at the time on his tablet, looked at Ethan, and then looked back at his tablet, in the way people look at things when they have decided that asking questions is not going to improve their situation. Ethan took his position at the rear left corner of the hall. Danny stood at the rear right. Aaron was outside in the corridor, covering the only secondary entrance. Lily was stationed near the side door, with her med kit and the specific calm expression she wore when she was paying attention to everything at once without appearing to. The hall itself was large and cold, and built to impress. The ceiling was high. The walls were hung with the banners of every Concord member species, including Earth's. A blue and white panel, near the far end, that was slightly smaller than the others, and positioned, Ethan had noticed the first time he walked in, just fractionally lower on the wall. Not enough for anyone to openly complain about. Just enough to make the point without making the point. Ethan looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back at the room and did his job. The session ran for 6 hours. Ethan stood for all 6 of them. He watched the doors, watched the delegates, watched the small movements of people in rooms the way he had learned to do over years of standing in difficult places, and needing to know what was happening before it fully happened. He did not think about the morning. He did not think about Proxima Station, or the story he had told, or the look on Valeth's face when she had said what she said before she walked out the door. He thought about the room and the people in it, and the job. That was what the job required. You gave it everything while you were in it. And you sorted through the rest of it later, on your own time, in your own quiet. The session ended in the early evening. The delegates filed out in their careful formal order. Valeth left, with her attendants and her Velketh guard, without looking in Ethan's direction, which was correct and expected. In a formal session, a Zyran royal did not acknowledge personal interactions through unofficial channels. Ethan understood this. He nodded to Danny, who nodded back, and they began the process of standing down. Sorath Vel walked past Ethan on his way out. He did not stop. He did not say anything. But as he passed, he turned his head very slightly toward Ethan, and his eyes, which had been their usual flat professional silver all day, shifted for just a moment to a color that was close to gold. Then he looked forward again and kept walking. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Ethan said nothing, but he noted it and filed it somewhere important. The second day of sessions was quieter than the first. The third was quieter still, in the way that things become quiet when they are nearly finished and everyone in the room knows it. The formal proceedings wrapped in the early afternoon. The diplomatic documents were signed. Hands were shaken, and the Zyran equivalent of hands were shaken. Small, careful smiles were produced by people who were professionally good at producing them. By evening, the Velkera was preparing to depart. Ethan's team had their gear packed and staged near the shuttle bay. Their transport back to Forward Operating Base Helix was scheduled to leave within the hour. Danny was sitting on his kit bag, eating the last of his ration bars and listing, out loud and to no one in particular, all the things he was looking forward to that existed on Earth and did not exist on a Zyran diplomatic vessel. Aaron was standing near the viewport, watching the stars. Lily was writing the letter she had tried to write 3 days ago and had not finished. Ethan was checking his gear when Velara, Valeth's senior attendant, appeared at the entrance to the staging area and said in a tone that left no room for interpretation that Princess Valeth was requesting a private meeting with Corporal Cole before the human delegation departed. Danny stopped eating. Aaron turned from the viewport. Lily looked up from her letter. Ethan set down the piece of gear he was holding. "All right," he said. Velara led him through 2 corridors and a long connecting passage to a small room near the forward observation deck. It was not a formal room. It had no banners and no ceremonial furniture. It had a wide viewport that looked directly out into open space, and 2 plain chairs and a low table with nothing on it, and the quiet feeling of a place that was used for actual thinking rather than official appearances. Valeth was standing at the viewport when he came in. She turned when she heard the door. She looked different without the full formal presentation of the sessions. She was still composed and still entirely herself, but something in the way she was standing was more direct, less arranged, like the version of a person that exists when they have stopped performing for the room and are simply present in it. "I wanted to speak with you before you left," she said, without the formality. Ethan nodded. He stood a few feet inside the door, easy and unhurried. "I am going to submit a formal address to the High Council," she said. "I have been considering it since the morning of the first session, and I have decided." She paused briefly, as though giving him the space to react, but he just listened, so she continued. "The Proxima Station incident will be entered into the Council's official record as a case study in failed intervention protocol. I will be requesting a full review of the casualty assessment standards that allowed 43 people to be classified as an acceptable loss, without a response being triggered." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I am aware," she said, and the faintest edge of something that might have been dry humor moved through her voice. "I choose to." She looked at him steadily. "It will not be a fast process. The High Council moves slowly on matters it has already decided it does not want to revisit. But it will be on the record. And there are enough member species who have quietly agreed with the concern for a long time, but lacked a voice with the standing to raise it." She paused. "I have the standing." Ethan believed her. There was no question in his mind that she meant exactly what she said and would follow through with exactly as much force as she was implying. She was not someone who made statements she did not intend to finish. "Thank you," he said. He said it simply, without weight or performance. Just the words, meaning what they meant. Valeth looked at him for a moment. Then her gaze moved, briefly and deliberately, to the collar of his undershirt, where the very top edge of the scar was visible, the same way it had been visible 3 mornings ago, when she had stopped at the partition, and the thing she thought she knew had started to come apart. "In the old Zyran tongue," she said, "there is a word for a specific kind of warrior. It has not been used in common speech for over 400 years, because most of the Zyran scholars who maintained the old language believed it described a kind of person that no longer existed, a thing that had passed out of the world." She looked back up at his face. "The word is Velsorenteth. It does not translate cleanly into Galactic Standard. The closest meaning is something like one who has been broken to the edge and held." She said it carefully and clearly, the way you say something you want to make sure is heard correctly. Ethan looked at her. He thought about Cal Durham in the maintenance shaft above Corridor 4. He thought about Karen Yost with an empty medkit and 4 people who needed to stay alive. He thought about Pete Holloway, standing at the end of the corridor with a rifle and a young man's fear, holding his ground anyway. "Yeah," he said. "We've got a few of those." Valeth nodded once, slow and deliberate. The Zyran gesture that Ethan had learned over 3 days meant something between acknowledgement and respect. He picked up his kit bag. He gave her one last look, steady and honest, and without any need to add more words to what had already been said. And then he walked to the door and through it, back down the corridor, back to the shuttle bay, where Danny was still talking, where Aaron was still quiet, where Lily had finally finished her letter. Behind him, in the small room near the observation deck, Princess Valeth turned back to the viewport and looked out at the open space beyond the glass. The galaxy was old. That had not changed. But she was beginning to understand that old did not always mean right, and that the youngest species at the table had been paying a cost that none of the older ones had thought to look at closely enough. She was going to make them look. The Velkara moved out of orbit, and the human shuttle dropped away from its side like a small bright point of light heading home. And the stars held still around both of them, patient and vast and entirely indifferent to the fact that something had just shifted, quietly and without ceremony, the way the most important things usually do.